We have safe spaces and microaggressions, trauma, instead of physical trauma, psychological trauma. And this is very reflective, I think, of a bigger civilizational shift that definitely affects the UK and other parts of the Western world, and I think is a danger to us. The left, who are supposed to help, the big mass of people with equality of opportunity, are focused on identity politics. And the white working class have been told to apologise for white privilege whilst living in crumbling estates. I think that's been tragic. So you've got the legal immigration and the illegal. The legal is just a serial betrayal by the Conservative Party of the manifesto commitments to reduce it. And then after Brexit, it went up to unprecedented levels. One of the great betrayals in all British political history.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Matthew Syed. Matthew, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. I'm conscious that it's almost like, in clothing terms, it's a mirror image, although is yours a jumper or a t-shirt?
It's a sweatshirt.
Okay, but I like the colour coordinate. I'm wearing a Marks and Spencer's cotton t-shirt. I find these incredibly comfortable. Well, I'm looking forward to the chat. I said to you just before we came on, I read a lot about politics and the state of the world. I enjoy reading. It's such an interesting period we're living through. I don't know if you feel that too. Technological change, this great geopolitical instability. And, I know you're at the forefront of debates about how to take this country forward. So I'm looking forward to the chat a lot. So, thanks for having me on.
I'm thrilled to have you on. I've wanted you on for some time. I read your columns, of course, in the Sunday Times and your writings for the Times. You write about lots of issues that are close to my heart as well, and close to, I'm sure, lots of my listeners' hearts as well. So it was hard to know where to start, but I think I should probably start by asking you about the budget, which I know the budget kind of puts people to sleep. It's although this time it's caused a lot of debate, it has caused a lot of fractious discussion in the media and even in the real world, one might say. But what have you made of the budget? What do you think it tells us about this government? And also, to draw out a point you made in a recent column, what does it tell us about not just this government, but the nations we live in today, the West itself, I guess?
Well, I think we are in a key period: geopolitical change, technological change, AI, and it's interesting to me that a couple of hundred years ago, I think Britain was perfectly placed to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution, partly because of our institutions, our cultural psychology, and we became a very dominant, impressive, can-do country that shaped a great deal of the modern world. And I think if you look at the energy transition, the potential of AI, which I think is transform. I was pretty dubious at the beginning about AI, but just looking at the rate of change, I think this is transformative. I also happen to think that some of the companies are overvalued. These are not mutually exclusive views, by the way. You can think it's transformative and that it's a bit bubbly and frothy at the moment. But I think that all the main parties are not yet thinking strategically about energy, the interface with AI, and the systems we need to really deploy in order to get ourselves into the vanguard of this change. And I'm very conscious that if we miss this chance, we could go into an even longer period of decline. And it's interesting to me, one thing I didn't quite anticipate is how well China is doing, despite a very different political and economic system. But it's really at the forefront of a number of emerging technologies. I think it's a genuine peer competitor to America. I'm a big admirer of America, the economy, the dynamism, the frontier spirit, although very worried about the political dysfunction, the corruption in both parties. And, I just think with a radical change here, for me, it's not, I don't know how you feel about it, Brendan. For me, it's not about taxation, the relative levels of taxation or the precise level of the interest rate, in a fiat currency system. For me, it's much more about shifting the energy system, removing the planning constraints, reforming the bureaucratic obstacles to genuine change, and then freeing a society which I do think has incredible collateral on the rule of law. I think is still good. it's gone too far. Judicial review has just become another obstacle to real change. I would do some pretty radical things if I was running the government now, but I do think it's potentially changed. It's interesting. I don't know how you feel about reform. I don't know if you saw Farage's speech the other week on the economy. He did talk quite sensibly about reform of the state, fiscal, I hate the word responsibility, but not just spending so much money that we're killed by the interest servicing, bringing some people with outside expertise into government. I thought all of that was pretty good, but I think we need to be radical now.
I completely agree. The thing that has frustrated me about the budget discussion, and we get this with every budget, I guess, is that it has become quite myopically about tax. Where's this amount of tax going to go? Who's going to get this? And there are some worthwhile discussions to have about the kind of burgeoning welfare state, the problem of welfarism, the way that traps people in a certain way of life, which can be as destructive for the people receiving the welfarism as it is for the people who have to pay for it. I think those are very worthwhile discussions to have, but there's a far larger discussion about growth, dynamism, the question of what is holding us back from pursuing those things. And I think a radical approach to dismantling the barriers to that, the red tape, the state regulation, all the rest of it, is probably the kind of discussion we need to be having. You wrote a piece about the problem with borrowing and the need to go a bit more cold turkey on all of this. I wanted to ask you what you thought that might look like if we were to turn off the taps, that stop taking all this money from the future, and think a bit more carefully about how we spend. What do you think that would look like?
I don't know if you've heard of this. It's a very, very poor phrase to capture something that I think is very significant. I don't know if you've ever heard of the phrase time preference. This is sometimes this is sometimes used by the Austrian School of Economics. It's quite important in psychology for what it's worth. Effectively, it means the rate at which one discounts the future. The discount rate, you might say. In other words, if I said to you, Brendan, would you rather have $100 today or 150 in a year from now? You might say, what would you say?
Um, in a year's time, I think.
150. Yeah.
Yeah.
What if I said 100 now or 102 in a year's time?
Oh, 100 now.
Right. So
Yeah.
by doing this back
Yeah.
and forth, you can get a sense of the extent to which one would rather have it now or be willing to delay gratification for a bigger amount later. Now, that's called the discount rate or the level of time preference. And this is a fundamental ingredient of growth. You have to be, all investment is deferred consumption. The fact that we're speaking on a computer means that someone was willing to do the research in order to figure out how to use chips and to build an infrastructure that allows us now to consume the blessings of that deferred gratification. And all growth emerges from that. It's not well known by economists, but you can look at the discount rate, average it out around the world, and it explains most of what you want to know about the growth level, the strength of institutions, even the level of social trust. It's a very important invisible force field around us. And Britain became much more willing to defer gratification over the course of the Middle Ages. The real interest rate dropped to about 5% in 1500. It was a lot lower than any other country on earth. And I think this is a Protestant work ethic, high investment. We're building out the platform for the Industrial Revolution. This has clearly gone into reverse. We borrow, effectively mortgaging the future to consume in the here and now. Is one example of this, but QE is another example. We're printing money to support consumption in the here and now, but with very big downside risks for the future. I think you see this in the fact that we find it very difficult to endure certain types of very beneficial pain in the here and now. So, you need to hear your argument criticized robustly in order to improve it, but it's not very nice now, but it helps us to, but we struggle with that. We have safe spaces, and the meaning of certain types of term have changed, like bullying has moved into microaggressions, trauma, instead of physical trauma, psychological trauma. And this is very reflective, I think, of a bigger civilizational shift that definitely affects the UK and other parts of the Western world, and I think is a danger to us. So I do, what you said about welfare is another classic example. We give people welfare in the here and now. It's fantastic. You have money, but it really corrodes the ability to go out and get work and to benefit from that all decisions take place in the stream of time, all of them. And there are almost always trade-offs. that are being implicitly negotiated individually, collectively. And I think we need to get better at doing that. So I agreed with you very much about the remarkable and very damaging shift in the welfare system. It's an absolutely wicked system in many ways. So yeah, so I would come in and definitely say, debt. This is the key thing about debt. It dropped after the Second World War because we're repaying the money we had to pay to stay alive in order to win the war. But after decades of peace, whilst not spending on defense, we've run up massive, massive liabilities. So it means that if we're hit by another shock, war, we're going to. I mean, one of the reasons we won the First and Second World Wars is because we could borrow at a reasonably decent rate because the markets trusted us. It's a I mean, the First World War, we were borrowing at a remarkably low level from American bankers to finance it. People had a great sense of our fidelity to the future. That's not our reputation now, and you can see that in rising bond yields. So that does worry me a lot, and I think we need to change that. But you're right, the best way to get on debt is to grow. And, if you look at China, the regulatory system is highly agile. They perform tons of experiments. There are people who are doing clinical trials, in different parts of China. They try, with self-driving cars, they're trying things. What works and what doesn't. They take small risks in pilot schemes where one or two people might get hurt. That's not great, I admit that. But unless one takes some risks, the whole society gets hurt because there's no innovation. And eventually other societies outgrow you and then can really hurt you. And I just think we've missed, for some reason, our political class just doesn't see the competitive world we're living in.
One area where the UK is excelling is, unfortunately, in online censorship. The Online Safety Act is preventing us from seeing vast swathes of perfectly legal content on social media and other websites. Thankfully, there's a really easy workaround, and it comes from our partners Private Internet Access, or PIA for short. PIA is the VPN I use and trust. In case you don't know, a VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Whenever you're browsing online on an unprotected device, your device is transmitting a lot of information out into the open, which can be seen by multiple parties before it reaches the website you're trying to visit. Instead of giving away your personal information and location to the world, PIA lets you change your IP address to one of 91 countries. This means you can gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. And it's not just that. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogs of content, but you can only access a fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. I love it. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema but being forced to sit in the hallway. I also use it all the time when I'm traveling to catch up with what's going on at home. Because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Macs, iPhones, Androids, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all the devices you own. So, sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Viewers of my show can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. So that's just £1.67 a month. And you also get an extra 4 months thrown in completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/Brendan. That's piavpn.com/Brendan. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You won't regret it. Sign up now at piavpn.com/Brendan. So interesting to hear you talk about China there, and I often think about the third runway discussion in relation to Heathrow. We've been talking about a third runway for decades, and in the period that we've been talking about that and having inquiries and discussions, China has built, 50 airports, 100 airports, just from scratch, whole new airports. It really is extraordinary. But it's interesting to hear you talk about the psychological contributor to this, because I think that is an overlooked factor, not just in the UK, but in Western society more broadly. We often hear about the structural barriers to growth, and people will talk about the crisis of austerity and all these various other things. It can get a bit technocratic at times. But there is this underlying.
But don't you think, sorry to interrupt, but the austerity, that word, it makes me smile a bit, because every year under the Conservatives, as you know, we spent more than we took in the public set, so in other words, the fiscal position was a deficit. In peacetime, whilst we were spending less on defense than America wished us to. And we called it austerity. I mean, most of the NHS kept growing, the pension budget kept growing, the welfare system, and it's called austerity.
Yeah,
I find
I
that
know.
absolutely shocking.
It's the most promiscuously overused word. I mean, there are lots of, I think, wrongly used words in the economy discussion. Another one, this is a controversial thing to say, but I think the word poverty is overused, and we often describe conditions that are less than desirable as being almost like a Dickensian form of poverty, which is not actually the case. We should be honest about that. And we refer to a few cuts here and there as austerity. And anyone who's lived through genuine austerity would know that there is a big difference here. But in
And
relation to that,
by the way, it's interesting,
yeah,
just on how psychology has changed. In the early 1970s, there was a big oil spike with OPEC. And when energy costs go up, you have to have energy in a society, otherwise you can't do
yeah,
anything.
oh yeah,
Very central
yeah,
part of the economy. It's interesting. You talk about how economists get things wrong. I studied economics at university, and energy wasn't mentioned at all. And when I did mention it to somebody, I remember Einstein said the laws of thermodynamics are the fundamental laws of the universe. The energy is at the center of all life and all activity. I think somebody said something like, well, the energy sector is only 5% of the economy, so it's not that important. But without energy, the rest of the 95% can't do anything at all. You really want the energy sector to be small, because it means there's more scope for all the things that energy does and the energy sector is getting bigger because it's swallowing more of our productive capacity. We need to. China, by the way, you mentioned the airports. I mean, it is building nuclear power stations. So this is nuclear fission technology. And the learning curve means that the cost per megawatt hour is flying down. In the West, with this, it's just going up and up and up. And it's taken decades for the third runway. But you go to places like Hinkley Point C, and the number of different planning restrictions, regulatory restrictions, which effectively mean that the cost per megawatt hour of electricity is crippling to our country and leading to deindustrialization, when we could have had just remarkable learning curve, learning by doing. South Korea are building nuclear power stations. Gee, I mean, there's a lot of energy in atomic particles, and it could be a road to fusion at some point. So the psychology, yeah, you're right. It's right there in the background always.
Um, I did want to ask you about party politics as well, without wanting to put you to sleep or anything, because it's not in the healthiest state in this country. I think most people would agree, although interesting things are happening. I think you're an interesting person to ask about this because you stood for the Labour Party years and years ago, and you were a Labour Party supporter for a long time. You became a member of the Conservative Party this year, I think. You switched sides, and I wanted to ask you what your motivation was there. Was it Keir Starmer's government that pushed you over the edge, or had you been losing faith in Labour for some time?
Yeah, I'd lost faith. So Miliband clearly was
Right.
not a great leader, I don't think. And but Blair's interesting. I'd be interested in your view on this. I thought on the economics, I mean, there's no doubt that New Labour benefited from a booming economy. So I stood in 2001, but I remember vividly going in to the selection meeting and being asked about the marginal rate of tax, and saying, under Callaghan and Healey, I don't know if you're too young to remember this, maybe but it was 83p that you paid an income tax at the highest level, and there was a 15% surcharge on investment, so you paid 98% of dividend income. That is a complete joke. Do you not think 2p in the pound
Yeah.
you're getting?
Oh, yeah.
And I said, I'm really committed to this. The highest marginal rate of income tax under Blair was 40%. The same as it was in the last period of Thatcher. You remember Nigel Lawson and Geoffrey Howe brought down the marginal rate. There was no triple lock, Brendan. pensions were rising with prices, not with earnings and whatever was higher. And I remember making this argument, saying that with an aging society, it's not great. I hate pension and poverty, but we cannot have a position where the pensions keep going up because it will be very difficult ever to reverse. Debt to GDP was about 30%. It's now 100%. So I didn't approve of everything. And in his second term, I thought the Iraq War was a mistake. But I stood on that manifesto proudly. But the whole of British politics completely changed over the subsequent couple of decades, where the Conservatives and Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens were just constantly outflanking each other to the left. I mentioned that oil spike, didn't I? I don't know if that was tough for people in the 1970s. But do you know what left-wing government said? You have to wrap up warmer. We have to endure the pain of this now. Because if we put it on the future and keep putting it on the future, that pain is going to be with us always because we won't be able to afford the interest payments. During the pandemic, the furlough I approved of, but the size and scale of it, the energy bailout under Liz Truss was initially envisioned as being bigger than the furlough. Can you believe that? A vast, vast amount of borrowing. And Labour obviously was saying, go further, go further. So, this is at party politics. I think that Labour have no idea, don't really have an analysis. I think what strikes me about it is very few people are going into politics with a genuine sense of what needs to happen. And I'm not sure that, if you did articulate the tough decisions that are required here and now to get onto the trajectory of growth, whether you'd get elected these days. But I joined Conservatives because Badenoch was at least saying, thought she did well in the debate for the budget, didn't she? But she was saying, we have to reduce the size of the state back to sane levels, get on top of debt. And she was even talking about simplifying the tax code. Look at the budget's ridiculous increased complexity in the tax code and the deadweight burden that exerts on a society. But Badenoch, I think, gets a lot of this.
I thought she did fantastically well in the Commons debates on the budget. Her finest hour, as lots of people are saying. I think that's true. Even her mimicking of Rachel Reed's voice, I thought was quite amusing. Why shouldn't we have some of that in the Commons every now and then? In relation to New Labour and Tony Blair, the thing I find most interesting about that period is that he's been mythologized in left-wing circles, liberal circles, as a bad man, in the same way that Thatcher has been. I mean, he's kind of on the same track as Thatcher. He's just misremembered, I think, as a uniformly bad prime minister, the man who destroyed Iraq, evil guy, shouldn't pay him any attention. But that's there is this tendency in British politics, isn't there, in British commentary circles, to have these sweeping judgments on historical periods, even recent ones, which actually don't tally with the reality of the time. And as you say, New Labour did some bad things, and New Labour did some good things. And in comparison to what Labour has become, it surely was a preferable setup.
Yeah, I've been trying to understand a bit more about why. So I follow, what people in Reform are saying. I think that could well win the next election. And they definitely are not keen on Blair. And it's because of not so much the economics. It's interesting what you say about the left are very condemning, are they, of Blair now, in almost as bad as Thatcher.
It's getting there, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know. I wonder if you went out there to the country, what the average person, I bet you with the average, I would bet that if Blair stood against Starmer in a referendum on who would be the prime minister, I think Blair would win. Don't you?
I think so.
Even with the baggage, I think.
Yeah.
Would he? I think he'd probably win. And I think he was a substantial figure. I thought Thatcher was a fantastic substantial figure as well, not perfect, but a major figure. And it is sad that they get kind of condemned in very sweeping and unfair terms. But don't you think all politicians, it's got toxic? It's very rare to hear anyone say anything nice about anyone.
It is very rare. I find myself in a situation now where I would have had a million criticisms of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and Thatcher. I was a kid for most of Thatcher's reign, but I would have not been a fan.
Go on, what did you not like about Thatcher? The kind of the industrialization?
Well, going after the miners, deindustrialization, I wouldn't be a fan of this super hyper nationalism,
Really?
various.
Okay, that's interesting. You don't like see that's one thing so that might be an interesting thing to disagree about because I think that patriotism, that kind of sense of a common purpose, is extremely significant in order to have a successful welfare state, for people to feel that they want to pay. I worry a lot at the moment about this exodus of people from the UK, talented, upwardly mobile, because I think we owe a real. I don't mind young people leaving, and expanding their horizons, but people who have benefited from this country saying, right, I can minimize my tax bill by going to Dubai. I think of this, the people who've been most let down over the last 15 years, I think of the white working class. The right often wants to protect the privileges of the upper middle class. I now have a foot in both camps. I went to a comprehensive school, relatively working class background, but now I can see how the middle class stitch up everything for their kids, because my kids are at top private schools. They in wonderful networks. I see how the internships work. So, and I think but the left, who are supposed to help, the big mass of people with equality of opportunity, have focused on identity politics. And the white working class have been told to apologize for white privilege whilst living in crumbling estates. I think that's been tragic. I feel, as somebody who's been lucky enough to earn a decent amount of money, I want to I don't want to go to Dubai. I want to pay into that. This white working class, they're patriots. They love this country. Their parents and grandparents died for this country. I think it's morally questionable. I don't want to be overly judgmental, but this idea we just pee off to Dubai. And by the way, Dubai, it's not what these people think it is. It is China and Russia benefit enormously from the idea that people in Western countries should go to tax havens and the Middle East and cut their tax bill, get their golden visas. The moment, it's a divide and rule strategy. The moment Western power retreats in the Middle East, these completely puny jurisdictions with tenuous property rights will cease to exist. People are not safe there, and their money is not safe there. We need to stand and fight for Western civilization, and I think I'm willing to stay and pay my tax. I think taxes are too high, but I'd rather stay and fight for a new government and a better system than go.
I couldn't agree more. And I agree with you on patriotism. I would make a distinction between patriotism and jingoism. I think there is a slight difference between those two things. But in fact, in relation to patriotism, I think that's probably one of the most important values of our time. And that's one of the reasons why I thought Operation Raise the Colors, where you had all these just regular working class communities up and down the country, right from Hillingdon up to Hull, across the nation, people were just raising the UK flag or the St. George's flag, reclaiming their streets, I guess is how they saw it, making an expression of national pride and undercutting, I thought, all the kind of divisive ideology of identity politics. It was a cry for a sense of national belonging, national togetherness against, I guess, the cult of neoliberalism or the cult of wokeness or the cult of identitarianism. But of course, the problem is they're instantly damned as racist. They're instantly called, the presumption is that they're only doing this because they hate foreigners, not because they love Britain. What have you made of those kinds of discussions and accusations that are made against those kinds of people?
Yeah, so I went to Epping and walked around, and just fantastic people, absolutely brilliant people, and the people I went to school with. Did I suffer racism at school? Yeah, a bit, but Britain's moved on so much. And these were, so I must have talked to 20 or 30 people, all of whom were absolute. I mean, I'm half Pakistani. They didn't give a stuff about that. They could see I love this country and want to make a contribution. All my mum's relatives, Londoners, working class Londoners, absolutely brilliant people. There was one racist. So I went into a bakery, and there was a guy, where was he from? I think he was from Cyprus. And there was obviously a regular there who was just an absolutely hardcore, unreconstructed racist. And he was talking about, the purity of blood, and and I mentioned my background. I could see he almost recoiled at the thought of having to talk to somebody who was half Pakistani. I looked at the owner of the shop, and he was kind of looking at me thinking, is this going to kick off? There was a wonderful photographer with me. He was going to run out of the shop at one point. I mean, it does exist, but I think that most people abhor racism. I can't tell you, as somebody of a mixed race background, how I think we've moved on fantastically. And I think we can, as you rightly put it, you can be there's a fundamental difference between feeling a sense of common purpose and hating anybody who is outside the nation. You know, I thought at the Olympics in 2012, I loved the fact that we really supported the British athletes. We wanted them to beat the athletes from Japan and Russia. Brilliant. But we also applauded when the others won. You know, we were willing to say, oh, well done. That's fantastic. You know, sport is about competition, right? Which is a healthy thing. Doesn't mean you hate your opponent. Federer and Nadal, great friends, great competitors. That's what I want to see in the world. We need to be able to cooperate, particularly with those nations that share our values. NATO, what a great contribution that group has made to world peace in Europe and beyond. I thought the people that I met in Epping and elsewhere with the flags, I reckon probably 90. There probably are a few racists. You know, I met one who was an absolute nightmare. But most of them are like my cousins and second cousins. Fantastic, genuinely good people who give so much to the community. You know, they give back to the community. If these people let me just say, the people listening to this who are thinking of leaving, yeah, okay, I get it. I'm not going to overly judge you, but there's so many people who are giving back and working hard, by the way. You know, my mum stacked shelves. My auntie worked in the NHS. You know, I've got a cousin who's a cleaner. They're paying their taxes. Yes, there are people on welfare gaming the system. There are even more people who are working unbelievably hard in low-paid work in doing their bit. Let's not forget them.
Oh, absolutely. I really agree. In relation to, I guess, the patriotism question and the flags question in Epping that you mentioned there, where, of course, as listeners will know, there were protests at the migrant hotel, as there have been in other parts of the country too. I wanted to ask you about the immigration issue and what you think that speaks to, or what you think it represents. I say this: you have immigration in your past, so do I. I'm a first generation Brit. Both my parents are immigrants. I do think the immigration thing is really out of control, and I think people feel. I think it's the issue through which people most keenly feel their disenfranchisement from public life, because they're told not to talk about it, they're told not to make a fuss about it, they're told the borders don't matter, people can come and go, whatever. People feel very strongly that that's wrong. And how defining an issue do you think this is going to become in the run up to the next election?
Well, I don't know if you feel that. I think that was true, but I don't think it's true anymore. I think everyone's talking it. You know, it's the dominant issue, isn't it, for a lot of people? Top on the list of concerns, reform are riding high, partly because of that. So you've got the legal immigration and the illegal. The legal is just a serial betrayal by the Conservative Party of the manifesto commitments to reduce it. And then after Brexit, it went up to unprecedented levels of a kind which has affected people in this country who haven't seen an increase in the infrastructure to meet the demands of all these new people, and have been, I think for a long period, kind of insinuated as being racist to raise it. That was one of the great betrayals in all British political history. I think that's right. And then on the illegal, I'm slightly mystified by it, to be honest. It seems to me that the only way to deal with it legally, if you want to do it within the law, is to change the rules so that you can detain and deport immediately anyone who comes here illegally. I think Rwanda would have worked, except that we didn't change the law. So when we deported them, the court said, do you remember that it breaches the Refugee Convention, something called the non-refoulement clause, because they might get deported from Rwanda somewhere else that might harm them. And then Parliament legislated to say that it is safe, which was kind of a bit of a tension between the law. But if you change the convention and whatever other, I'm told by the Conservative peer who did the report on this, you need to change withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. probably unilaterally, because they tell me that it's very difficult to renegotiate that treaty with all the other signatories to it. But then you can detain and deport. That has nothing to do with whether you bring in refugees, by the way. You can bring in as many refugees as you wish through safe and legal routes. It just means anyone who comes illegally gets deported, which is obviously fair and right, because the more you have who come illegally, it obviously constrains those who you wish to bring in through legal. I honestly don't understand. I went to see Lord Hermer. I wrote a piece on this, invited me in to talk about it. I hope he wouldn't say that this is an unfair recollection of the discussion, but it seemed to me there were no serious objections to what I was saying, but maybe just politically difficult to be seen to be withdrawing from the ECHR. It's a mystery to me, that one.
Yeah, I think anything that gets in the way of the sovereignty of Parliament, I'm not going to be a fan of it. And that goes for the Refugee Convention, ECHR, anything else external to the people we elect. I think there's a problem there if it can throw its weight around in these problematic ways.
Okay, but do you really think that all of those are bad? But what about NATO?
NATO, I don't mind military alliances, especially when they are mutually beneficial. And I think it makes sense for allied nations to come together and pool their resources in that way. But if it were to overly interfere with the decision-making of elected bodies, then I'd have a problem with it. There's an argument that NATO does that to a certain extent because Trump has used it to put huge pressure on governments in Europe to ramp up defense spending, regardless of whether they want to or not. So there is a level of interference there, but I think less so than the Refugee Convention. So once you're a signatory to that, there is a clear demand on you through this binding treaty that you have to allow certain people to come in, you have to feed and board them, you have to look after them, and you have to put them through certain processes, which obviously runs counter to what the public here wants at the moment.
The ridiculous thing of the treaty is you only have more responsibility to them if they get to your territory. You're okay to block them coming and giving Gaddafi arms to kill them on the way through Libya, but it's a ridiculous treaty in this day and age. It just doesn't work. But on NATO, you have to have the nation states sign away democratic latitude to an extent, because if you're confronted by an axis of China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Britain can't defend itself adequately against that alliance of strategic interests. And so do you not think that that the only way, I mean, just in a straightforward battle, you have to make sure that if your jurisdiction is small, you have to coordinate, and therefore you have to have command and control at the higher level. Otherwise, you can't have interoperability of the armed forces. I just don't think democracy within a given jurisdiction is going to give you what you need unless you surrender a lot of that sovereignty.
I think the starting point of international cooperation or internationalism, or however we might want to describe it, the starting point of that has got to be strong, independent nations. Nations that have a clear sense of who they are, what they want, what they might be willing to give up in order to align with other nations, what they won't be willing to give up. I think that's the key lacking ingredient at the moment. What we have in Europe in particular are actually withered nation states after years of outsourcing sovereignty, giving up decision-making to external bodies, and even internally giving up political decision-making to quangos and to these layers of technocracy that we don't have any democratic control over. And when you have that kind of withered sovereignty, that kind of desiccated nation, that's when these treaties and these external bodies become more problematic because we're not clear of what we want. We're not clear of what we're willing to give, what we want to get back. So it's the interplay, I think, of the self-destruction of our sovereign integrity combined with the growth of these external bodies that we have to adhere to. That I think that creates a toxic combination.
Yes, and so I mean, obviously, this cashes out in whether you're prepared to. I mean, if you look at the willingness of us to surrender our sovereignty on things like internet domain names, and there's a massive hidden infrastructure of international cooperation that underpins global free trade. I mean, hard power is also there. You know, you need to deter piracy in the shipping lanes and all the rest of it. I think I'm less worried about doing that perhaps than you are. I mean, if there was an imminent alien invasion, I would be perfectly happy to surrender power temporarily just to save planet Earth under some overarching command and control that would
Yeah.
otherwise mean that we lost. I think these are big questions now because a lot of the problems we face are very, as it were, globally. We don't have an imminent alien. What would actually happen in an imminent alien invasion, by the way, which I used to think that if that did happen, we would unite as a species.
No.
But that wouldn't happen. What would
No.
probably happen is what happened when, Britain went into India. The aliens would, or when the Romans came into the UK, they would go to one country and say, work with us and we'll work with you and then you can help us run the overall system at the end of it. They'd use divide and rule. And it probably would work. If you actually look at almost all colonialism, it always uses that model that the external actor is able to find an internal one to work with in order to get their own way. But it would be nice to think we could come together as a species.
That is a very nice thought, but we can't even really do it within nations at the moment, never mind across the globe.
Although that's a big strength of the West, by the way, is that almost all the other nations outside Western and Northern Europe, and those nations to which we emigrated, they're often very tribal, if that makes sense. These are very kind of 1,000-year-old allegiances that makes it very difficult to coordinate at the level of the state because you've got all these competing tribes or clans or kindreds, these kind of blood-based sectarian affiliations. That's a big problem for the world. So the West, even though we are divided a bit these days, we're a lot more cohesive, I think, than most of the rest of the world.
Matthew, I want to ask you a couple of quick questions about sport before I let you go. I want to ask you about the Maccabi Tel Aviv controversy, which is ongoing. This is when their fans were banned from attending the clash with Aston Villa earlier in November. I thought that was a pretty scandalous decision. Others agreed. I think you wrote about this in your column. The day before we are speaking on this podcast, the young boys played against Aston Villa from Switzerland. They played against Aston Villa, and there was actual trouble. There was actual violence. There were clashes, and there was a bit of hooliganism. But I don't remember any campaigns to have young boys fans banned from Britain. Certainly, there wasn't a huge fuss about them. There's an extraordinary double standard here. There's an extraordinary level of hypocrisy. We now know that West Midlands police said things about Maccabi fans that were not accurate. What have you made of this episode and what it tells us about Britain right now?
But by the way, so that was last night, was it? Villa against, yeah, I flew back from Budapest last, so I missed all that. Was it bad, the violence?
Not particularly bad, but there were clashes and things were thrown at players and yeah.
I'm instinctively very pro-Israel. I think it's an amazing country and in a very tough neighborhood. I was very struck. I went to Trafalgar Square on the day of some of the, there were protests. Who were they now? Palestine Action, and they have been, what's the word, the technical term? They have
prescribed.
Prescribed.
Yeah.
Prescribed. So I wanted to go along and check it out because they seemed like, people who had principled views and, they weren't beating up the police. They were lying down and having to get carried off. And so I thought this will be interesting to go up to Trafalgar Square. It was just incredible. I would talk to people. It seemed very extremely charming people. And then I sort of was curious because the Gaza is a very, complicated, the Middle East is a complicated place. And I think I said something like to one of them, how do you sort of apportion responsibility for what's happening in Gaza? Because a lot of people have died there, as you know, between Israel and the IDF and Hamas, which obviously, in my view, provoked this attack from Israel because they were very worried about the Abraham Accords being extended to Saudi Arabia, which would have isolated Tehran, which of course funds Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and all the others, and benefits a lot from this instability. And the atmosphere turned on a sixpence. This woman I was talking to just said, "Pardon?" I said, "Well, where does Hamas fit into this?" They got abusive. And then others started joining in. And then antisemitism, the hatred of Jews, conspiracy theories. And at the time, Trump had just come up with a proposal to try and get peace. I asked them about it. They just were not interested in that. They were only interested, really, many of them, there were two who were a bit different, in just expressing this deep hostility towards Jewish people in the Jewish state. And I do think that there has been just an ambient rise in anti-Semitism through the universities partly, the kind of woke march through the institutions. And I do worry about it a lot. And I can't tell you, Brendan, the number of Jewish people have got in touch to say at least you have some vicarious sense of what it's like to be Jewish in Britain today. And I think, this football game and as you say, the police, they came up with an explanation of what they were doing that didn't tally with what the Dutch police had been saying. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that I think is reflective of this strange and very dangerous shift.
What do you say to people who say there's a difference between criticizing Israel and hating Jews? I mean, because technically that's obviously true. All countries should be open to criticism, and you've criticized Israel for some of the things that it's done over the past 2 years, and lots of people have, including its friends and supporters, precisely because
And a lot of Jews.
and a lot of Jews. So there's clearly a difference. But when you go to that Palestine Action gathering, or when I've seen some of these protests on the streets, I've gone to observe some of them over the past 2 years. And I think to myself, but you're not criticizing Israel. You're doing something different. You're getting absolutely hysterical about Israel. You are singling it out as the most evil nation. I mean, it's something different from normal political discussion, isn't it? If we're being honest.
So I definitely think you should be able to criticize the Israeli government, as Jews and Israelis do in a democracy, very vociferously. Wonderful free speech. I think Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, I don't think they've served the Israeli national interest in what they have done in many significant respects, both in their foreign policy and some of the judicial reforms. But you're right, it shouldn't be held to a different standard. I also think it's very important to distinguish between Putin and the Russian people, between the Ayatollahs. It's different so in Israel, it's a democratically elected government, so it does reflect to an extent the popular will. The real risk for Israel at the moment, I think one of its biggest risks is, yes, Iran, of course, the network of, who are recruiting, by the way, the network of jihadi groups at a remarkable rate now. That's been one of the consequences of Gaza. That will come to hit us hard across the Western world. But one of their big problems is the birth rate of the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and the fact that many of them don't bother working. They just read the holy book, and they take a lot of welfare. I mean, that is eating the Israeli solidarity alive, because all these young people are going and risking their own skins while the ever-growing community is paying nothing in and not going. And I mean, they're trying to change that, but Netanyahu hasn't properly addressed that because it's part of his coalition, have been for a long time. But with these non-democratic societies, I think we do need to make a distinction between Putin and the Russian people, between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people, between the Ayatollahs in Iran, who are absolutely hated by many of the Iranian population, the poor people of North Korea, who are imprisoned by this criminal family. I think it's very important always to keep that distinction in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Matthew, I want to ask you one more question about wokeness and where it's at the moment, but I want to do it through the issue of sport, because sport is an issue close to your heart. You've written about it, you've played it. I'm sure that when people see you on Newsnight, they might not know that you have a history of being a top table tennis player. In fact, the top table tennis player in the UK. Something to be very proud of. I want to ask you about wokeness, but through the issue of sport and through the issue of what are referred to as trans women in women's sports. I would refer to them as biological males in women's sports, which I think is fundamentally unfair. Over the past week, we've had the case of Andrea Thompson, who's a British strong woman, and she came second in the world's strongest woman to someone who is male. And then it was discovered, and Andrea Thompson eventually got her medal and won her prize, which is absolutely the right thing. There seems to be a shift in relation to sports. We've had Donald Trump's executive order saying blokes out of women's sports. We've had the Olympics seemingly coming to its senses. Lots of brilliant sportswomen like Sharon Davis, Martina Navratilova, and others. Lynn Pinches, the pool player, have stood up for the right of women in sports, and it seems to be changing. What's your take on that issue and what it tells us about the state of wokeness more broadly?
I think the peak wokeness is gone, hasn't it? Would you agree with that?
I hope it has. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it has. I feel much less, I hope I never pull my punches, but I definitely remember going when I didn't understand the trans. So it was I don't know, it must have been 12 years ago. And there was I was going on I used to do the Sky newspaper review. I didn't know what it meant. There was something about, what was it, cisgender
Mm.
and TERFs. And and actually, I think I was on with Ella Whelan. Is she still
Oh, yes, she
yeah,
still
who's
writes for us. Yep.
just a fantastic person. She was great on Question Time the other week. I don't
Yep.
know if you saw her on that.
Yes, she's
And
great.
she said, "Look, if you're not totally," she was great to do the paper review with because she was just a very highly intelligent and completely willing to discuss without falling out, which I love. Um, and she said, "Look, if you're not completely across these issues, let me take the answer on that, because otherwise you might get it wrong and get cancelled." It was at the absolute peak of what's effectively the tyranny of the minority, a small group of people trying to impose their will on others by cancelling and attacking and issuing death threats to anyone who dares to disagree. I think I would salute their courage. I wasn't in the vanguard of that. Well, you may have been. I wasn't in the vanguard. I was kind of following it, trying to understand it, probably for a couple of years before really being willing to speak openly. So I paid massive tribute to those who. Remember J.K. Rowling? The stars of the films turned on her. Who, and I thought that must have been very difficult emotionally for her as a beloved figure who's suddenly become divisive, and people were kind of wondering which way the debate would go. Do you remember there's probably a moment in our history where people were like, it could go all the way in the direction of the trans argument, the very ideological trans argument winning. I better not get. Companies were so worried about it. The long and the short of it is, I think that these people are incredibly brave and deserve a huge amount of credit. And somebody like me who came along slightly afterwards doesn't deserve any of it.
Oh, no, you deserve some. But yeah, even within turf kingdom, there are disagreements.
But what's the nub of that
So
disagreement?
Janice Turner would see Graham Linehan as being a bit too abrasive, a bit too confrontational. I actually like his style. I think he's very funny, and he pushes this issue with great force and momentum, and I think he's contributed to the change that we're seeing as well. But there are disagreements over tactics, style, all those
Oh,
kinds
it's
of usual
tone more
things.
than substance.
I think so, yeah. You see that in a lot of movements these days. But so I guess to finish off, where do you think wokeness stands? And I mean, I agree with you that we do seem to have passed peak woke, or peak wank, as Rod Liddell once referred to it. But with an election coming up, the rise of reform, it does seem to be falling apart. Do you feel optimistic about the withering of that kind of crazy politics and maybe a coming back to normal politics?
I think there have been some great trends. I think the reduction in racism in this country has been fantastic. The reduction in sexism. I watched an episode of Are You Being Served the other day. It came on like UK TV Gold. And Mr. Rumbold, do you remember this program?
I've seen repeats of it, yeah.
So Mr. Rumbold, who's kind of like a very warm, avuncular figure, pretty much demands that the kind of pretty blonde who played Pauline Fowler in EastEnders, but as a young woman, lift her skirt and show her suspenders in order to get a promotion. And you watch Heidi High, or Del Boy in Only Fools and Horses uses the P word in one of the episodes. That we've moved on. Fantastic. Woke, however, had nothing to do with this kind of progress where people are judged on their merit rather than their color, where we're trying to create equality of opportunity for people to do fantastic things. And it became a bizarre obsession with it's kind of almost racist, with these characteristics that were somehow definitional of who we are. It got away from what I thought was a wonderful progress of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, and they sometimes call it a purity spiral. I think that's a good term, where people started to burnish their progressive credentials by saying ever more ridiculous things, and I think we have moved away from it. A lot of people are deleting their pronouns, are they not? And I think the left. It's a shame in a way, because the Democrats lost their way and I think the Labour Party has. I think there's a massive opportunity not really left or right, but just to say things that I think most people would agree with, and to go back to what we said earlier, the fundamental question of our age, which is how to get rid of these massive obstacles so that we can grow as a country, all of us, of whatever color.
Matthew, thank you very much. Thanks again to PIA VPN for sponsoring this episode. Take control of your digital life and get PIA for 86% off. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code.